Thank you, Mr. Dean. Thank you, Professor Orlov, for organizing my visit. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy lives, particularly here as the semester draws to a close, to be part of what I hope will be a conversation. And I will start us off with 30 or 40 minutes of thoughts, but then I really do want to get into some kind of a dialogue and go back and forth, because I think we are at an auspicious moment from a point of view of the planet's future. Auspicious in part because a new Congress has just been elected, one that I think looks from a point of view of the environment to present some challenges. A auspicious moment because the UN Secretary General convened in September a climate change summit meeting in New York, hoping to mobilize leaders across the world to launch a new climate change agreement a year from now at a conference of the parties to the Climate Change Framework Agreement that will be held in Paris. Auspicious as well because here at Stony Brook, the Brookhaven Lab contract has been renewed. So thank you all again for being here, but I really want to talk about what I think is a crisis in environmental protection, a crisis that requires us to reframe how we address energy and environment issues. And really, and this is the summary slide and the only one that you heard we're going to have, that requires us to shift gears from a focus on environmental protection, which has served us well for 50 years as we think about how we've gotten to where we are in the protection of our land, our air, our water, and the planetary resources like the atmosphere. But I think environmental protection now needs to give way to a broader framework that increasingly is talked about as sustainability. And I want to introduce to you some thoughts on what that transition needs to look like and how we are going to move from 20th century environmental protection to 21st century sustainability. So I think we start by recognizing that we owe a great debt of thanks to the political leaders, the environmental leaders, the advocacy groups who launched us on the current trajectory. The work done in the late 1960s into the 70s, the passage of a series of path-breaking environmental laws, the Clean Air Act of 1970, the Clean Water Act of 1972, and a whole series of acts that helped us to begin to get our arms around and regulate chemicals and toxics and a variety of other issues, including in later eras the release of chlorofluorocarbons into the atmosphere that was breaking down the ozone layer, the Montreal Protocol, and the Framework Convention on Climate Change that was negotiated and then signed in 1992 that is up for re-examination over the next year. So there has been a lot done, but I am doubtful that that same path will carry us forward as well as it has served over the past several decades or 50 years, in fact. So I want to talk about what we need to do to prepare for renewed momentum. And I want to talk to you about some elements of what I think is required. And notably this. I think the structure of law, which those of us in the business call command and control regulation, where the government dictates specific outcomes, a technology to buy in many cases, the best available technology is the term of art, or a specific emissions limit, that structure of command and control government mandates has gotten us going, but I think is not likely to get us where we need to go in the future. We are going to need to do more to harness economic incentives and market mechanisms and reframe how it is we guide behavior towards sustainability. And that concept, by the way, has a number of elements. I think the work in the 1980s by the Brundtland Commission does a pretty good job of telling us that the core elements of sustainability would be a management of our economic future in ways that promote growth and help lift people up, but in a manner that does not compromise the future generations' opportunities for the same. So it's got a series of elements to it that I think are now very important. Attention to long-term trajectories, the integration of issues, the recognition that there does need to be economic growth and that poverty is one of the most serious causes of environmental degradation, largely because people who are very poor make short-term choices that often compromise the environment. So I think we do have a framing concept for the 21st century in sustainability, but we have not yet worked out the action plan around it. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. I think there is also, and this is why I say we have a crisis of environmental protection, there is an emerging backlash against the current approach to environmental protection. We saw it some in the election process over the last few months leading up to the early November election. We saw it even more sharply in the presidential election of 2012, where there were a number of candidates, particularly in the Republican primaries, who outright denounced the Environmental Protection Agency and the current structure of environmental regulation in America. And I think for those who are in the environmental arena, there was some degree of shock that you could get such a broad-based assault on what is a much revered structure of environmental protection efforts, including these laws that were adopted over 40 or 50 years and seem to be doing a pretty good job of improving the quality of our air and our water. But I think there is a lesson that needs to be listened to. And I think that lesson suggests that we can be more focused, more effective in our environmental regulation. And you heard the dean in the introduction say my mantra, which is a lighter regulatory framework that does not lower standards. And I think the prospect that what was first thought about 50 years ago could still be optimal today is almost unimaginable. We live in a world that's completely transformed, and it should not be a surprise that we now need to recast our model of environmental protection around this more integrated concept of sustainability. In fact, if I had to say a single word that is critical in my mind to the future of the environment and the planet, it is innovation. I think we need an innovation-centered approach to environmental protection and energy, and I'm going to talk about why those two are mirror images of each other and need to be addressed as a unified package. But I think an innovation focus is what is fundamental. And I want to talk a little bit about the backdrop against which this recasting of environmental protection needs to take place. Because I think changed circumstances define what our opportunities going forward look like. And I would argue that we have seen over the 40 or 50 years that the environmental framework of our current moment has developed a quite significant set of shifts in fundamental groundwork on which any program of environmental protection or future sustainability has to build. And let me highlight some of these mega trends, as I call them, that I think are giving us a signal that new directions are required, a new approach, a new sustainability model is needed. First is a recognition of the limits of government. So 50 years ago, we were in the throes of the Great Society. The ambition for government solutions to societal problems was almost unlimited. I can see some in this room remember those days. Others of you do not. It is hard today, in the era of limited government that we live in, to imagine the hope and ambition around government solutions that existed in the 1960s. It is completely transformed. I believe today we are in an era of limited government, not only expectations, but of resources. And that requires us in very important ways to rethink where the action to give us the solutions to these problems we face is going to come from, and not to jump too far ahead, because you've already heard that I spent a lot of my career working at the business, energy, and environment interface. I think the fundamental shift for the 21st century is that the critical point of leverage for change will be the business world and not government. So that's the starting point. Now, having said that that's critical, part of this is because the government has limited budgets and is in, I think, a perpetual state of budget crisis at this point. So the hope that we're going to get vast new investments of resources to take on problems like the challenge of clean energy, which is necessary to be addressed to solve climate change, just doesn't seem to be happening. Third, I think we live in an era of economic stagnation. And this is not, in my mind, simply a question of the downturn of 2008, 2009. we are seeing a structural change as the framework of the global economy shifts. And the economic strength that the United States had coming out of the Second World War that persisted through the 60s and into the 70s will not be the norm going forward. We're in a much more complicated, diverse, and spread world of economic opportunity. So I think there is in the United States a growing economic growth imperative that climate change efforts and environmental efforts and sustainability as a concept does not want to get crosswise with. Because the prospect of achieving success on our environmental agenda, on our planetary protection program, is going to be much greater if we are running with, not against, the tide that calls for an uplifting of the middle class and new economic growth prospects for working people. Fourth, we do live in a world that's urbanizing. The world of environmental protection that we designed 50 years ago had a big emphasis on conservation and on issues that relate to open space and open places. I think the agenda increasingly is going to be around how we manage cities on an integrated basis, not just energy and environment, but transportation, design, architecture, infrastructure, all as part of a package that needs to be managed for sustainability. Fifth is population. The population is continuing to grow, although in differential ways. Much faster growth in Asia, and frankly, pretty rapid growth in the United States compared to Europe. But population pressures remain part of the story that has to be thought about. I think we're also seeing the limits of natural resource availability in some critical categories. And I'm thinking in particular of things like rare earths, the fundamental materials that go into things like our cell phones or electronic devices. And I think there is a growing recognition we have to recast how those materials are managed, with a lot of talk now about a circular economy. I think we also have just begun to tap one of the critical mega trends of the last couple of decades in the environmental arena, and that's the ability to bring to bear information technology as a solutions provider to the sustainability challenges. And I say that with some surprise because I think of environmental types as eager to embrace the future, as open to change. But I would also tell you that it's my observation that the environmental arena is curiously unaffected by information technology breakthroughs and the digital revolution. Almost every other part of society has been more fully transformed. Nobody manages a baseball team today the way they did 20 years ago. They don't even think batting average matters anymore. It's on-base percentage. But very clearly, the Moneyball world of baseball, where we watch statistics and manage with a very fine-tuned focus on data, and lots of it, has transformed how we do sports in every level. It's transformed how we do marketing in the business world. It's transformed how hospitals make judgments about patient care. And yet I would argue that the environmental arena has been less transformed